Okay, so Danny is probably best known as one of David Cameron's favourite speechwriters. But in fact, actually, he's a dedicated social entrepreneur with some considerable track record under his belt, particularly focused around the rehabilitation of prisoners. But the focus of Danny's presentation this morning will be a piece that he wrote for Reaction a couple of days ago, and that will really that's about exploring the possibilities that Brexit arises for the resiting of power particularly from Whitehall back to local communities. So can I just ask everybody to give our first speaker a big society welcome, Danny Kruger.
Thank you. So I will press. Oh look, I can start. He hasn't started yet. Okay. Thanks very much for attending this session. I just want to set the scene a bit with a bit of a political observation. I think obviously we are very familiar with our polarised political discourse at the moment. We have this populist challenge from left and right. My contention, however, is that beneath all of this high-level discord, there is actually what I call a radical consensus forming, actually a community of ideas that is taking root in our culture, and that's a good thing. And actually somehow these populists and extremists are part of that consensus. And the consensus proceeds from the sense, which increasingly we all share and recognise, that in the modern world people are feeling increasingly rootless, disconnected and alone. And the talks earlier this morning reflected on that. And I think that a lot of the appeal of the populists is a reaction to that. And actually a lot of what Jeremy Corbyn is saying and people are listening to with approval is his appeal to some very conservative instincts and impulses. He is in fact a very conservative politician in my view. And the consensus, as I'll describe it in a moment what that looks like, but it is a consensus because people from across the spectrum and from different ages are feeling it. And again, I think that the impulse of younger voters and even the post-millennials, people who are just becoming of age now, surveys of teenagers demonstrate the same appeal for, I think, a very conservative set of ideas around belonging, connection, community, family, even tradition. And the radical expression of their politics doesn't reflect the underlying ethics or ethos that they're coming from. So there is a consensus forming around what the problem is and even some of the solutions, but the solutions are quite radical, which is why I call this a radical consensus. It really is about busting open a whole set of monopolies and concentrations of power in our society and our economy. I'm not going to talk much about the economic concentrations of power and the challenges there, but to talk quickly about the social platform that I think is this radical consensus consists of. In a sense, some of these ideas sound boring, and that is a big challenge we've got. And people who are involved in this sector have to get used to some pretty tedious concepts, but they're actually really important and I think exciting. So the radical consensus consists of a set of political principles and policy directions. The first one being about prevention, not cure. We've set up a system which is designed to rush in once problems have got really acute and fling an enormous amount of money to try and ameliorate them, to mitigate the symptoms of problems rather than prevent them. The radical consensus consists of preventing problems with, again, a whole set of quite, I think, conservative political principles about family stability, about the sort of moral language that people grow up speaking. So we need to be more preventative in our social approach. Secondly, a funding mix, which consists of people putting their own money into social causes, whether that's philanthropy or self-paying for services. So we need to mix the funding, break up the monopoly of Whitehall and the Treasury on funding. And thirdly, the agency of delivery needs to change from agents of the state to agents of society. So we need a civil society revolution, and this is what I wrote the little piece about for Reaction. Now, as I say, it is a challenge to generate excitement around this, as David Cameron found with the big society. We're talking really about charities and the voluntary sector taking more of a role in public life. I mean, well done for staying awake so far. I often think the two most boring words in the English language are voluntary and sector. And I've worked in it for 10 years. It is difficult to generate excitement for this, but actually we are talking about something really important and actually that can genuinely get people out of bed, which is that the strength of our society is in our societies, in the communities that we we live and work in. It's not about outside professionals coming in. For some time I lived in a housing estate in West London, the White City estate, and I didn't stick out because everyone was there. There was a bit of a weirdo, coming from different places around the world, different backgrounds, all the rest of it. It's not a homogenous community by any means. And the wealth, the social wealth in that place is absolutely extraordinary. But every morning, as I was leaving, obviously, to head off to a expensive part of London where I work, with a tide of poorer people mostly heading off to their probably not very well paid jobs elsewhere, an incoming tide of middle class professionals was walking into the estate to serve it, to deliver all sorts of services, working for the state and the charity sector, some of which my charities. So this isn't an easy nut to crack, but there was such strength and wealth and assets, as we call it, in that community that needs to be empowered. So. Let's think about what that looks like in practice. I think we are this amazing opportunity that Brexit gives us. There's all sorts of threats to civil society and well-being and so on if the economy tanks as a result of Brexit. But let's hope that doesn't happen. The freedoms that we're going to get as a result of Brexit to revive civil society are quite tremendous. In practical terms, again, stay awake. VAT at the moment, charities lose millions of pounds a year because they can't claim back VAT in the way businesses can, because of rules set in Brussels. We can reform the VAT regime and literally pump hundreds of millions of pounds into local communities that way. State aid rules set in Brussels mean that we are absolutely unable to support non-profits and social enterprises and small charity groups in the provision of public services. We can have a revolution in social enterprise. We can create a whole new sector, a new market for a social economy if we want to, and we want to change procurement and commissioning. So I will finish with this observation that politics was defined. The ancients called the word politics comes out of the idea of the city, and how do we manage life in a city? That is what politics really is about. People who are not related to each other like they are in the countryside, traditional small-scale tribal communities. And they did that, and this is the great inheritance of the West, is the notion of civil society. Yes, there's the rule of law and all the institutions which enable it, but in practical terms, it's about civil society organisations, associations, and institutions which come together and manage the common life of the community by a combination of economic and social activity. And I think we need, in this dawning of this new age that we're entering upon, to recover the spirit of the Victorians and to start a new movement around civil society and break down the centralised monopolies and create a bottom-up civic society and a new social welfare model. And 5 seconds to go.
Okay, thanks, Danny. Well done. Almost inch-perfect timing there at the end. So next I'm going to call Sam. Sam Bowman is a fellow countryman of mine. Landed in the Adam Smith Institute about 7 years ago as an intern. Worked his way right up to the very top of that august institution and is now the director and is, in his own words, I think, pro-free market, but is also trying to save free marketeers from their own instincts. So, without any further ado, I will hand over. Can you, everybody, just give Sam Bowman a great hand?
Thanks very much, Mick. I usually open with a joke here to kind of lighten the mood and get you on my side no matter how much you disagree with me. And the best I could come up with was something like this being less Glastonbury and more the Hay Festival. But that was so bad I thought I'd say I'm not going to make that joke. So I've only got a short period of time to tell you about housing and why it's so important. And I think everybody more or less agrees that housing is a really important issue. So what I want to do is put a little bit more meat on those bones and hopefully give some pragmatic and politically possible ways of solving that problem, or at least reducing it. So I could tell you things like rents being the highest in the UK being the highest in the European Union. I could say that the number of renters under the age of 35 has doubled in the last 20 years. I could say that in 1997, 56% of people owned their own home. Today, it's 36% under the age of 35. And I could say that rigid housing markets are the cause of the productivity puzzle. But instead, I just want to emphasize what it's like to be a renter, because the Conservative Party almost never talks to renters or about renters. The Conservative Party always focuses on home ownership, and with some reason. But the reason that the Labour offering to young people was so appealing was because they actually had something to offer to young people. They talked about what it's like to be a renter. They talked about predatory landlords who don't care about you. They talked about what it's like to live in insecurity, what it's like to know that you're going to have to move out of your home in a year, what it's like to not be able to invest in your home. You can't redecorate because it's not your place. You don't have a long-term lease, as they do in some places in Europe, in Germany, so you can't set down roots in the area. And for many people my age, I'm 29, you can't have kids because you don't know where they're going to live. You don't know what school they're going to be in, and you don't know if you're going to be there in that area. You don't even know if you're going to be in that city in a year's time. So the big problem, I think, is not that we don't have rent controls. I don't think that Corbyn's policies would work. I think they would probably make the situation worse. But politically, it helps to know that somebody cares. And politically, it helps to know the first thing you really want to know if you have a problem is that politicians actually are aware of your problem. And the Conservatives have singularly failed to show the young people that they're aware of the problem of what it's like to be a renter, and perhaps somebody on a middle or a low income, what it's like to want to own a small home someday. So I think the thing that the Conservatives need to do is change the rules of the game so that housing is no longer an adversarial thing. So it's no longer a win-lose thing where you have a big developer coming into a community wanting to build new homes. I, as somebody who'd quite like to own a home someday, would like that to happen, but I don't live in the area. All the locals stand to lose out, and there's really nothing there to square that circle. So I think what we need to do is change the rules of the game so that existing homeowners benefit, and hopefully so that we create new revenue streams, so that things like social housing, perhaps, can be part of the mix as well, and that we can actually pay for that. Because I'm really sick of hearing people saying how much we need social housing without acknowledging how expensive that is and how difficult politically it's going to be to raise the tax that we need to spend money on that. So I want to talk about two ideas. I have lots of other ideas, but I'm going to talk about two that I think might actually work. The first is to acknowledge that probably politically the green belt is not touchable. I would love to build on some of the green belt. We have proposed that you'd only need to build on 4% of London's green belt to free up land for 1 million new homes. I think politically that's not going to happen, and certainly not from the Conservative Party. So if we acknowledge that the amount of land that we have in London and in fast-growing towns like London or like Cambridge and Oxford is fixed, then we need to use that land more efficiently, and we need to use that land more densely. That doesn't necessarily mean tower blocks. In fact, tower blocks compare quite unfavorably to mansion flats and to low-rise, high-density terraces that you have in places like Pimlico, Victoria, and other parts of London. So rather than making this something that's a grand plan, a kind of a big top-down decision that City Hall has to decide, we should be devolving power to street level, because it's people who live on a street that stand to benefit the most from a development. And those are the people who get to decide, or who should get to decide, whether they're willing to tolerate the extra building, whether they're willing to tolerate the change in the nature of that street. So if we devolve votes over densification to streets, we can give them control over things like, for example, infill. We can give them control over whether you're allowed to convert a semi-detached street into a street of Parisian-style, dense, terraced flats. And we can talk about whether it's possible on that street to go from small one-off houses to flats to much, much denser accommodation. The second proposal I have, and the second thing I think is really important to focus on, is planning gain. This is the money that accrues to the landowner if they get planning permission. Right now, you can buy an acre of agricultural land, farmland, for about £8,000, depending on where you are in the country. Around Reading, you can actually get land for much cheaper than that, so maybe £3,000 or £4,000 per acre in some parts of the area. If you get planning permission for that land, and I've seen fields that are identical, one with planning permission, one without, that land will probably rise in value to maybe £3 million per acre. So you're talking about an uplift of 300 to 400 times, and in many cases it'll be even more than that. But most of that money, almost all of it in fact, goes to the landowner, which rewards lobbying, it rewards luck, and it doesn't, crucially, reward locals. What we want is to change the policy so that that planning gain and that uplift in value goes primarily to local residents, so that they want developments to take place near them, because their infrastructure will improve, so that potholes can be filled, so that refuse collections can be improved. The things that they care about on a day-to-day basis can get better because there is a revenue stream for them. And we want local government to be enthusiastic about this, because it means money for them that really would change the direction of local government funding in general. So there are two ways of doing this. As an economist, I would prefer to do it through auctions. Auctions are very efficient. They mean they'll go to the highest bidder, and that's great. I think politically that's probably not going to happen. So instead, perhaps what we could do would be to empower local councils to buy land at the market rate, not at the rate that it would be if it had planning permission, grant themselves planning permission, and then sell it off again to the market for private development. Now, there are problems with this. There are certainly some difficulties, and the implementation, I think, would have to be done in a rolled-out way so that we could see what the difficulties are and how do we work it. But the fact would be that we would be giving local councils a massive new revenue stream, millions, if not billions of pounds across the country, and we would be creating new homes. Housing is not just a question of cost of living, it's a question of productivity. The reason for this is that it means that if it's too expensive to move to Cambridge or Oxford, and you are a would-be computer scientist or a would-be researcher there, you're being kept out, and you're being kept away from the job that makes you most productive. Now, this might sound like a small issue, but on a macro scale, it's enormous. In the US, the Nobel Prize winners estimated that the country could be about 12% richer, 6 years worth of growth, just by bringing planning laws in places like Los Angeles, San Jose, and New York down to the national average. If we did that in the UK, it's possible that we may be able to give people 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 pound pay rise just by making it easier for people to move to the jobs that they need. I think that we are right to be focused on the problem of extremism. We're right to worry about this appeal of the left and the right extremes. The way we fix that is by giving something to people to hold on to, and giving them a future that they can set down roots on and have something to lose, so that they don't want to take that risk with the extremes. Thank you.
Sam Bowman there, showing us how the Adam Smith Institute has taken us right back to the social conscience of the original man himself. So, our last speaker, before we go to the Q&A, really needs no introduction, but I'm going to try and introduce him. Do I call you Mr., Sir, His Lordship?
I prefer Lord Bird.
Lord Bird, right. Lord Bird, otherwise known as John Bird, one of the most famous and rightly respected social entrepreneurs in the country, has done things that other people just didn't believe was possible, and that is really how society changes. Lately, made a lord, raised to the upper house, and is, as you might imagine, in there trying to cause some positive trouble and some positive change. So, please, put your hands together for Lord Bird.
It's actually the Lord Bird, because there's only one. It's very interesting listening to the two speakers about prevention and about housing. It's really, really interesting for me, and I'm so glad I came, because what I'm doing in the House of Lords is recognizing the fact that both houses are crap when it comes to deliver social opportunity, social investment, and all those things. What both houses are obsessed with is getting the poor through the day, the week, the month, or the year. They don't invest in dismantling poverty. I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't any money that doesn't go into trying to dismantle poverty, but most of the big government machinery is absolutely useless in getting people out of poverty. When you find a situation where 37% of our children are failed at school, and they make up 80% of the prison population, they make up 50 to 60% of the people who use our A&Es as drop-in because they've got depression, because they've got problems of health to do with what they've eaten or what they haven't eaten or what they've drunk. When you look at the long-term unemployed, if you ask them one question, how did you do at school? And they nearly always say crap. I'm a product of this system. I was a person who went to school, did very, very badly, left school, couldn't read and write, learnt to read and write in a boys' prison at the age of 16, And what was the most wonderful thing that separates me from virtually all of the people I come from is because the state got hold of me and realized that after from the age of 10 to the age of 16, I'd been in and out of institutions, and I'd been a naughty boy before the courts. What they did was they over-invested in me. So whereas my brothers, members of my own family, have never really learnt to read and write properly, what they did with me is they turned me into the posh git I am now. What they did was they invested in me to such an extent that it cost twice what it cost to put me through what they put me through than if I'd gone to Eton. So you got this really weird thing. And what they left behind was this terrible mess, which was called secondary modern school and then comprehensive school, failing over a third of our children, who then become the backbone of poverty, the backbone of reaction, and the backbone of long-term unemployment. So what are we doing about this? I go into the House of Lords and I say, you are all doing no good unless you help us dismantle poverty. I'm very glad that Mr. Kruger is talking about prevention. What I've been doing is I've been creating something called a Prevention Alliance. Because the real thing is we have to break the left, the right, the center argument. We have to move most of our efforts towards prevention. When I was born just after the Second World War, 20% of the income, of the budget of the National Health Service was spent on prevention. They were always giving us stuff to put in our mouths and eat milk and all sorts of things. And then they were doing all this fucking stuff. Sorry, all this stuff. And we were running around. And everywhere it said, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. And it was called social medicine. They got rid of that. And now only 3% of the National Health Service budget is spent on prevention. Isn't it mad? We live, I tell you, I got into the British middle classes and I realized they knew nothing. They were crap at thinking. I'm now in the House of Lords, and I meet people in the House of Lords, and I meet people in the House of Commons, and I think, when are you going to wake up to the fact that until we start dismantling this kind of separate thinking, until we start investing in prevention, we're not going anywhere. Now, I have to say that I have made a few mistakes. I've made a few enemies, but I've made a lot of friends. And what is so exciting is that people are looking for a way out. I think we are in a new world. We are in a new world that's broken up, that's breaking all the old values. People are asking about community. I voted to stay, but I wanted to leave, and the reason for that was because I was shit scared that what would happen to my children and my children's children, my grandchildren and all that. But the thing is that Brexit has to be turned into its opposite. The only cure for leaving Europe is to go deep into the community, work with the community, and do the kind of stuff that we are hearing here today. We have to break the monopoly of this up, top, down. I said at a meeting the other day, and I did upset a few people in the kind of Beatrice Webb world, the people who put the National Health Service together. I said, you know what the real problem with poverty is? It's always being administered from above. The cure for poverty is to get the poor involved in their own transformation, and we don't bloody well do that. What we do is we commission people, we get charities, we get local authorities, we get government telling the poor how to do things, almost as though the poor were a different species. I come from that different species, and I realize that all of us are the same species, and actually if you were to rub the surfaces of most people at this conference, they will have come from poverty 1 generation ago, 2 generations ago, and love it. And this is the interesting thing. Somebody burnt the candle at both ends, maybe your father, your grandfather, or your great-grandfather, and got out of poverty. Why can't we give that same inspirational opportunity to the poor rather than administering and cementing them in poverty? That's what we do. God bless you all.
You disappointed me, John. That's the first time I didn't get the blowing whistle. So, right, now, we're going to go to Q&As very quickly. That's a lot to remember, 3 different presentations. What I'm going to say to people is we want as many of your questions as possible. Try and keep, I'm going to put the same kind of strictures on your questions as I did on the speakers. Try and keep it short, pointy, and we'll get through as many as we possibly can. This gentleman here.
Thank you. So, Dean Russell, I studied in Luton twice before as a candidate, so I've seen all sides of society, including being hated when knocking on doors. But the reason for my question is that I think the Lord Bird's question point was really powerful. I genuinely believe, and I promise this isn't a speech, but I genuinely believe nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, I really want a crap day today. I want to wake up and have the most awful day. Yet people still live that. And I think the worry I have is that we live in an environment, and education-wise, we're not teaching kids and people, even older people, to do what they are passionate about, what they're brilliant at. We're trying to take them through this process of getting exams and scoring and scoring and scoring. And they're not coming out living the lives that they should love. You know, and I think the question back to the panel is, how do we break that cycle? I'm not saying we change school system totally, but how do we get people who are poor and the most vulnerable in society to feel they've got ownership over their lives again? Because I feel that's where the big disconnect is coming.
That's great. Okay. I'm going to take another 2 questions from people. Let's see. Yes.
Yeah, Chuck Berry, Wiltshire, actually the Housing Cabinet Member for Wiltshire. Question for you, first of all, is how does the compulsory 1% rent reduction on social rents help us as a council build more houses on our land, and we've got plenty of it. It's actually stymied our whole capital budget associated with that, so that's one. John, or the bird, what we need to do from the point of view of the NHS is break the segregation between adult social care and health, and make the 2 work together. We're trying to do that in Wiltshire at the moment, but it's something that needs to be done from the top, actually, because it's bollocks. And lastly, from the point of view of poverty and enabling people, what we need to do as a council is understand that the 75% of your money in council tax goes to the disadvantaged, and we need to use it better to enthuse them and get them on board, as opposed to being against us.
So that's 2 questioners and 4 questions. Before we forget them all, I'm going to take Sam. If you take that last one that was pointed to you.
Sure. I mean, I don't think it does. I don't support that kind of policy, and I think it goes to the heart of one of the problems with social housing. Now, I don't think that we should rule out social housing altogether, but we need to remember there are 3 big issues with it. The first is that it's easy to neglect. It's very easy for politicians of all stripes to neglect people in social housing, and that's a political reality. We might have the best intentions of the world, but that's what happens in all parts of the country. Second is people don't want to live in social housing. If you actually poll them and you actually ask them, as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has, overwhelmingly, 87% of people will say they want to live in their own home, they want to own their own home if they can. A very small number of people say they want to live in social housing, much less than actually do live in social housing. And I'm really, really not happy when I hear people who in themselves would never dream of living in social housing talk about how important it is for other people to live in that kind of housing, if we have a better option. There's a real inefficiency here as well. Imagine if we gave people all of their welfare in food stamps because we're worried they're going to spend it on fags and booze and things like that. It would be insane. They'd live like kings, they'd go to Waitrose and so on food. In every other area of their lives, they'd scrimp and save and they'd live like paupers. That's not the way, and it goes to the point that John was making. We give people control over the money that's being spent on them by giving them cash and moving the welfare system towards cash payments that they get to decide how to spend on themselves and what's best for themselves, not through gigantic government projects that I think often fail in their own ends.
That's great. Danny, I'm going to come to you next. If you could pick up both the specific question I sent to you, but this other thing about the deeper value of life. Not, I mean, specifically cited in education, but I think more generally than that.
Just quickly, just give me your question again in a nutshell, because I didn't really understand.
Okay, in a nutshell, it was localism was all about being local and helping and allowing the local government to help people. It didn't go that far because they constrained it, so you weren't able to enable the less well-off, the challenged individuals to get better. Because all the money and help was taken away.
So in a sense, it's one point. How do we create a vibrant civil society beneath the level of local authorities that local authorities are in fact supporting? And I think the question about education is really important as well. We've fetishized education in its most formal and reductive sense. We've essentially extended the primary school model of education up into the teenage years. We're kind of warehousing our teenagers in this passive education model whereby they're expected to sit there and sort of be filled up with information. Obviously, we had a problem with low literacy and numeracy, which is still very serious. So we do need that basic level of education. But my vision is, and the West London Zone, Children and Young People, which I share now, is a mission to bring in the whole range of civil society organisations around schools, because the 20% of kids who struggle in education and in the rest of their lives, it's not because of the failure of the teachers. We've often got really great schools in West London in particular. The problem is the wider community that these kids are growing up in, and there are the resources in the community to support them. So what we need is the local authorities, which we actually have in West London, supporting this wider set of institutions and organisations, community groups, to help those kids. But the fact is, quickly, point that isn't made enough in these debates, most charities are not very good at collaborating or even delivering high performance. And having run charities for years, I know the problem. So we do need a major uplift in the performance of the social sector, and that's going to happen if we hold them properly to account, pay them for outcomes, force them to collaborate, and empower communities to monitor them properly.
John?
Yeah. The point about education, I actually believe we need to tear up the curriculum and throw it away, because I think it smells of 1972 at best, if not 1968. It is absolutely crap the way we teach our children. Absolute rubbish. I am a young father in spite of appearances. I've got a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old. I've also got, they all go up to 51. So the point is, and I put them through the state system, and I now put my youngest children who have dyslexia, like me, I put them through the Steiner system. And the Steiner system is the basic system that comes from Germany. Nearly most of the public state schools in Germany have a Steiner side to them. And they learn about systems, they learn about the weather, they learn about their bodies, and also. And what the first thing I would do is start teaching children about systems, about the system of their body, about the weather, and all sorts of. I teach them how capitalism works. How comes capitalism has so many enemies? And when you ask them what's wrong with it, they don't know. All they know is it doesn't work. There are so many ignorant motherfuckers out there. I'm sorry about it. But the point is, we need to reinvent education so that we don't give it to people like they gave it to my brothers and me and all the others, who then become an enormous social problem. And that, I think, is the interesting thing. The thing about social housing, I don't like social housing. I got out of social housing as soon as I could. What I love is sociable housing. And I've actually said, why don't we talk about sociable housing where we mix up people? Why don't we have people why don't we have estates where people, instead of being people who are ghettoized as social failures, why don't we mix them up? And it happens in a way through the right to buy, and you know, estates. The estate that they built on where I was born is socially mixed, because people through right to buy and all that. But it works better when you socialize. The word social stinks, because as soon as you put that label on somebody, you are, in a sense, saying your children won't go to the university, nor will your grandchildren, and you'll have some crap job. That is what we've got to change sociable housing, create sociable housing rather than that. And I think you're right, 75% of local authority money does tend to disappear on the people who are the most needy. And it's all emergency. It's all emergency. It's treading water. It never is about dismantling the reasons why people are in poverty.
Great, thanks, John. Okay, some more questions. I don't know how much time we're going to be given, but over here, Nigel.
Nigel Hall, we've hit the inspiration today, and we've really got down to sort of people and caring, and it's really powerful, and we need it, you know, out in the visions there. So the question is how, and I think I get it right, you're saying government needs to very savvily and sensitively enable and get its sticky hands off this area, let it really grow sustainably at the right levels from underneath. So how about getting the two major political parties to get together around this? Because people are fed up with the political football between the political parties. Something as important as this really has got to be cross-party, and we've got to make a difference on behalf of the nation and the future generations.
So in other words, concretizing this radical consensus that Danny's talking about. I'm going to take another 2 questions. So if you've got 3 questions, just give me one of them so we can all remember which ones they are.
Hi, so it's Jamie Mazra from Onside Youth Zones. Given the work we do with young people, it's not surprising that I'm a clear fan of prevention being the cure. The question is really for Lord Bird and Danny, which is how do you square the circle of the time lag on prevention exercises tend to be, we're talking 5-10 years before they work, but political cycles are much shorter than that. So how are you going to get the political parties to back prevention when it doesn't give them political brownie points?
That's good. And that actually complements that first question rather well. One more question. Somebody over here.
Thanks, Rob Wilson. I really like the idea that you put out there about residents benefiting from development in their area. But I think one of the key concerns on that would be councils tend to get their grubby hands and spend the money in ways in which local residents don't want. So you'd have to come up with a system that got local residents actually involved in spending the money and targeting the money on the things that they really want to. And it's going back to this whole localism thing. How local do you actually go? On Lord Bird's ideas, I think one of the answers to that is social prescribing, in that we offer poor people lots of pills and lots of things to medication to help them with their problems, but what they actually need is basic things like access to exercise and things of that nature. And finally, also with the poorer people and how we fix the problems, we need everybody to have skin in the game. We need, whether it's local authorities, government, charities, social enterprises, businesses, everybody has to be involved making a contribution if you're going to make a difference. And in some ways, that's what Danny's trying to do with his West London project. He's trying to get everybody involved so that everybody has skin in the game. And that is the answer to a lot of the problems we face with poorer people.
Okay, so there's several questions there. Suggested need there for a consensus, which runs against the real dynamics of the usual political game of trying to cut things up. Freeing policy from political interference. And how do you sell prevention when real prevention, only can take place over time frames that are longer than, say, a fixed term parliament of 5 years? Danny?
So I'll take the first and the last question. I mean, the point about the radical consensus is that it's not a kind of cozy agreement on the detail. It's the set of principles which I think is now increasingly shared. I think it's important to have, at a national level, a big argument all the time going on. So, the binary politics can be divisive and yah-boo and all that, but it actually it enfranchises it empowers the electorate to make a choice. I think it's good to have that. Okay, so what I think we need is local accommodations between the politicians and between civil society and business. We need these partnerships to come together in a practical sense at a local level. Let them argue at the national level about, Venezuela or Trump. Let's have proper local practical conversations about how to really do this locally. Jamie totally right about the long-term challenge. Rob Wilson, actually, who was the civil society minister in the last parliament, is the best person to argue this, how to get the Treasury in particular to invest over the long term. I think the answer is outcome-based commissioning and social investment, so that private money takes the risk for failure. That's the way to persuade the Treasury to say, please put up money now. If it doesn't work out, you won't have to pay because our private investors will pick up the tab for failure. But it does require serious political leadership to say we're going to make long-term plans. I mean, they do it on big infrastructure projects. Why can't they do it for big social projects?
Okay. Right. John, do you want to make a quick kind of response?
Do my best.
Yeah.
Do my best.
I want to get another round.
Yeah, it's interesting what Rob says about striving, if I've got it right. One of the elements that is always left out of governments and Queen's speeches is the element of how do you train people in postponing gratification. If you can actually get that into the lives of very, very young people, then, like my wife is a great postponer of gratification, whereas I'm crap at it. I always want today, because that was how I was socially trained. If we can get striving, if we can get that in at the early stages, we really do need to work on that. I think one of the real problems that we've got is that we we are fixated with representational democracy, and we haven't moved on really very well to participatory democracy, and where we need to be in the future, which is cognitive democracy. I think the Brexit was a brilliant demonstration of the people who voted to stay didn't know what they were doing, and the people who voted to leave didn't know what they were doing. It was a real case of where we needed a cognitive democracy so that we could really know what we're talking about. And we have stuck there with representational democracy. We need to move on. More localism, what you're talking about. Yeah.
Thanks. I agree with you, basically. I think the street votes and the kind of infill and bottom-up density point, the value does accrue to the landowners directly there, and so that kind of answers your point. For a long time, I talked about, because basically the person who benefits from being able to build a block of flats on a piece of land is the owner of the piece of land. So if a street votes to allow that to happen, or... Well, that's exactly the point. Most streets would not vote for, and when I say a block of flats, I should be saying mansion flats and kind of dense terraces. Most streets would not vote for that, but a couple of streets would, and that's much more than we get right now. And you have a built-in incentive, because the couple of streets that do get all of that land value. All of that land value uplift goes to those residents, so it's a direct thing. When it comes to the broader question of land value capture, say conversion of farmland to land for housing, I used to talk about only compensating local residents with cash. When you talk to them and when you poll them, most people say, and they might be lying, say that they actually would prefer that money to go to the council and go on local services. That might be completely, trying to impress the interviewer with how social you are and how kind of socially minded you are, but that's what they say. I think probably the best thing is to experiment and to allow councils to be flexible and see what works best for them.
Okay, I hear whistles going off in the background, so I think we're almost imminently going to pull in. I'll take a couple of questions which we may not get an answer to. One thing I'd like Danny to think about, partly was that issue about all the different parties that have to have skin in the game. What we know is there are several political divides in this country. Some of them are party political. There's also a territory divide between central government and Whitehall and council, which I'm sure the cabinet minister or cabinet member for Wiltshire knows only too well, but I think that's something to think about before we go.
Thanks a lot. It's not really a question. I think it's just pulling together some of the themes. The Lord Bird said about instant gratification. We know that the impatient modern thing is often about instant gratification, but pulling together the connections we can make and empower and enable and leverage and incentivize, with everybody having a stake in the game, and working out how to get local communities physically creating and building their own futures. Because true gratification comes from using your hands, using your ideas, having a stake, and that gratification is much more enduring, much more powerful than the instant gratification you talk about.
Thanks, Andy. One more, I'll take one more. I saw one hand.
Simon Wilson Stevens. I work in a drug rehabilitation unit in London. It's a private one, and I've got Lord Bird in front of me. And I've got to ask this question. I've always wanted to ask you this: would you legalise drugs? Would you legalise drugs?
Hold on, John. This is the most exercise I've had in weeks.
Sorry, I think drugs are legal. Like murder is legal. Because, anybody can kill anybody. The state doesn't have a monopoly on violence, and it doesn't have a monopoly on law. And drugs are legal. You can go into some of our most secure prisons, and you can get more drugs there than you can get on the streets. So it's a chimera, or whatever they call it, to talk about the legalization of drugs. I can get anything. You can anyway. Anything else?
Yeah, right. Just final reflections, really, before we finish. Danny, do you want to just give us your final thoughts?
Sorry, it might be a bit kind of cheesy, but I think this gathering is a representation of the politics we need, and it is about people coming together. It's great that there's quite a representation of politics. I don't know if everyone realised that Alex Smith, who was on the stage earlier, is a Labour Party member. He used to work for Ed Miliband. He's the guy who does the North London Cares thing. I think that's why he didn't want to tell his mother he was here. He didn't explain that. Is he here? Yeah, there he is. He wimped out of explaining, confessing his politics. And there is a new movement, I think, that brings a lot of people together. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be having big philosophical arguments. I think there is big philosophical arguments, but we're kind of getting there. And I'd love to see this thing spread around the country, get out of the southeast. Not that I would leave.
Cheers, Danny. And Sam?
I have a great fear. Every MP and minister from the Conservative Party I've spoken to since the election has been so petrified by what happened and so shocked by what happened. They don't realise how much they dodged a bullet. And they don't realise that what they have is 3 to 5 years to actually do something so that they have something tangible to sell to people on the doorstep. Every proposal I make to them, they say, well, how's that going to sell with voters? How can we persuade voters? That's not interesting. Voters don't care about land value uplift. They do care about houses, and they do care about the cost of housing. The key thing is use the time you have now to have something to show for yourself and show for your time in government in 3, 4, or 5 years, whenever the election is. That's the thing that I think many, many Conservative Party MPs don't get yet. And if they don't get it soon, then they're not going to get it at all.
Thanks, Sam. And last word to the Lord Bird.
I think this has been a brilliant talk, and I'm so glad I've been allowed to participate. And I think this is we've got to do more of this. We've got to break this kind of separation, and we've got to get into participatory democracy. We've got to get into the local community. But I would say there is a big thing hanging over us all, and that is when the banks who lend the money, when 87% of that money is spent on the buying and selling of property, and what is left goes into businesses and all that. And compare that with Germany, where only 20% is spent on property. Then you can see where we've got our social values. You see where we've got all of our social mobility. It's all tied up in the ownership of property. And why wouldn't you want to own property? Because you will then have your children, you double the chances of your children going to school, to university. That is one of the big things. We underinvest in the future. We underinvest in new businesses. We're hanging around waiting for them to happen, and we should be inventing them.